So hello, we're here with Natascha Radclyffe-Thomas, Professor of Marketing and Sustainable Businesses at British School of Fashion in London at Glasgow Caledonian University, and Vice Chair of the Chapter for UK and Ireland of Principles for Responsible Management Education. Welcome, Natascha, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much, Julia. Really great to talk to you.
Well, I would like to start by asking you about the role of Prime and its increasing relevance in business schools in the UK.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for people who aren't aware, Prime is a largely voluntary run organisation. It's connected with the United Nations Global Compact, and its mission is to promote responsible management education, primarily in business schools, but really in any higher education institutions that teach, business and management type topics. And it kind of really, I suppose, emerged, we think about it, with when we had the financial crash in the kind of early 2000s, there was a lot of anger placed on the sort of business community and the finance community, and kind of people started questioning education's role in that, and primarily business schools' role in that, because how had we got into this situation? And so I think it really put to the forefront, and it probably for a lot of people working in higher education at that time started to think about the relevance of things like business ethics and responsible management, and then also ideas around things like corporate social responsibility and etc. So Prime, I guess, grew out of that type of thing, and it's a global organization. And the UK and Ireland chapter was founded in 2013 and is really one of the more active chapters. We cover the majority of the business school kind of community, and the role of Prime within the business school is really one of, I suppose, it's promoting the agenda of responsible management education and all the principles of Prime. So across teaching, across research, and across all the wider sort of activities of a university. But also it's really a nice sort of network, a supportive network. And so I think one of the reasons that I was first engaged with Prime was, I suppose, educating yourself, finding out more about responsible management education. So not just the research into it, but actually how do you teach for responsible management? And one of the great things that they do is ask institutions to kind of report on their progress against these sort of targets. So it's also quite a good space for self-reflection, I guess, for institutions. And I think it's a really powerful community of like-minded educators and academics who want to partner with their students and with industry, really, to promote a more responsible business sector. And I think it's something that the wider business agenda has actually caught up to in the last couple of years. So I think probably when I was first involved with Prime, it was seen more as a bit of a niche or an add-on, and the whole idea of sustainability was quite narrowly understood. But I mean, you'll be aware that now that's the kind of number one conversation in business schools. It's certainly front of mind for most students, if not all, if not educators. And with things like COP26, again, the SDGs and how we achieve them have become really primary, and also, I guess, the idea of how younger people maybe can engage with them. And one of the areas that they're asking for is education that kind of intersects with this area.
And well, now I would like to reflect on your role as academic, you as an educator, and you're a great advocate of introducing sustainability to your own modules. And which are the key barriers faced by educators to introduce sustainability within their practice?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that is a great question, because I think for lots of people, myself included, when you might have a personal commitment or interest in sustainability or something like business ethics, but it's not necessarily something that you've actually been taught, yourself in that formal academic way. And these topics are really complex. So I would say the first barrier is people thinking that they have to know everything about the entire topic before they even, start to engage with it. And I think that sometimes leads to the idea that there's a kind of sustainability expert who can be parachuted in, to do that job. And it kind of, I think, in a sense, it can sometimes be you know, that can be a big barrier because people just feel like their own knowledge is not enough. I think the next barrier is that it is extremely complex. So you might start to think you've understood one area of sustainability. So I would say, you know, for fashion, that a lot of people, their first connection with it is probably about materials. And so people start to think about different materials and maybe organic materials versus, you know, man-made materials and that type of thing. Even that conversation is not a very simple one. But, you know, once you start to understand that sustainability is systemic, that it has, you know, environmental, social, you know, climate justice issues, you know, then it can become extremely overwhelming. I mean, there's also the science of sustainability. So if you're thinking about sort of carbon neutrality and that sort of thing, even just sort of getting your head around understanding all of those things. So I think some of that can be a barrier. But then also I think there's another one, which is that you know, let's face it, it's quite a depressing subject area as well. So I know within fashion, for example, you know, when I was first leading modules in, you know, sustainable fashion, then, you know, students come in, they're very interested, you know, you're laying some of the information before them and their eyes are open to things that they weren't really aware of. And they start to think, well, you know, they're questioning their choices. Do I want to be studying fashion anymore? Do I want to work in this industry? You know, so you've got all of these things going on. But what I would say is when you do engage with it in any meaningful way, it's tremendously rewarding. And I have found it a very collaborative space. So I have found a lot of people very generous with their knowledge and experience. So when I was kind of starting, I guess, on my journey of sustainability education, whether that was people within, you know, formal education spaces or informal or, you know, industry spaces, then lots of people are really happy to share their experiences and perspectives and expertise. And there is a lot of information out there. But I think, you know, those two things, the confidence and the complexity, can be big barriers.
And what about students' engagement? I've been asked like many times, and recently I started collaborating with teachers in primary schools, and they ask, yeah, but how do I get them to engage? Because to some extent, it can be a little bit imposed and in the school, but then you go out and each one has a family dynamic, different behaviors. So how can it be done in a genuine manner so that it has a real impact? And the future leaders, in your case, because you're in university, but in any consumer overall?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I think you're quite right. You don't want to be imposing things. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is education for sustainable development really requires rethinking how you're teaching and how you're engaging with learners. You absolutely don't want to be, you know, just presenting people with a bunch of facts, statistics, bad practices, and sort of giving them this as a package and saying, there you go, absorb this. Here's what you should think about this. And that's what I mean about the complexity. So not just related to sustainability, but all of my kind of ideas around pedagogy and engaging learners are about giving people agency, giving them knowledge and agency to make, you know, informed decisions about their personal choices, about their academic, you know, interests, and about their professional choices. So even at any age, you know, that's the sort of I suppose that's the structure or the manifesto that I would have about teaching. But it does mean, you know, again, you have to question things like the power of the teacher in that dynamic. How do you try to readdress those hierarchies? You know, how do you try to bring in voices that might not be heard? How do you let students bring their own personal experiences into the classroom? So one of the things that I've been, you know, working on recently with a great friend and colleague of mine, Halle Moravej, who's based at Manchester Metropolitan University, is bringing our two areas, fashion and food, together and having these creative conversations and interchanges. And the reason that we think fashion and food are great sort of ways in are everyone's familiar with them. Everyone, you know, interacts with food and fashion on a daily basis, but they're also really deeply, but as well as being personal, they have real cultural significance, and they're also big industries. So you can really engage, I think, with every level of sustainability and even management and business questions through the lens of these two areas. But it can be a more accessible way. So you can just think about, you know, the journey of your t-shirt. you know, Fashion Revolution is a great organization who asks, you know, who made my clothes? You can engage in those kind of conversations with people. And we also have the movements of things like slow food and slow fashion. So you can talk about, you know, the politics of these areas, you know, in that way as well. And I think when people can relate to their everyday activities, it's not to say that they as an individual need to be responsible for sustainable solutions, because I think that's, you know, that's not the impression I want to give, because we know they're systemic and there's, you know, there's government and state level, you know, responsibilities. But I think it's just a little bit easier for people to start to think about that. And in a sense, food might be more obvious than fashion. I think that's why fashion often follows food, because you can think about seasonality of food. You can think about food that grows in your locale probably more easily than you can think about textiles and production for fashion. But I think, you know, it's just letting people understand their own relation to it, and understanding their agency. So the choices they can make, and not, you know, which includes not engaging with things like fast fashion if they want to. But I think that's the connection. That's the way I found a connection. And especially because I've worked with students from, you know, all around the world. I think when people can really link these issues to their own lived experience, it can be very powerful. So if we talk to social entrepreneurs in different parts of the world, then students can recognize, you know, the situations that they're talking about, whether it's gender discrimination, you know, whether it's exploitation of workers, and people can think, you know, they can relate that to their own personal experiences. And then I think that becomes a lot more powerful as well. But I think there's one final thing as well about that, is quite often in sustainable fashion, people imagine, you know, all of the bad things happening far away in a different part of the world. And undoubtedly there is exploitation from the global north to, you know, of the global south. But we know in the UK that there are bad practices, you know, right in our inner cities as well. So I think it's something as well that, you know, you can really bring it home to people, that actually this can be their neighbours. This could be something that's close at home, and we don't have any kind of right to feel a moral superiority in this area.
Well, yeah, that's a big one, because in many conversations I have, people say, oh, no, this just happens in Southeast Asia. Well, recently we saw what happened in Leicester, and we're only thinking, let's say, more on the part of human beings, and like the ethics of exploitation, but we can also think of the impact it has on local communities, how big corporations affect or impact the smaller businesses, like small shops that are trying to make that effort to go that extra mile. And as you said, it's too complex to understand just in a PowerPoint, let's say, or a small conversation. But one of the big issues is how we get the industry involved. We've seen like so many greenwashing campaigns, or just tiny efforts made to change the impact, while it's just the business model is not working. And as you mentioned before, it's a systemic change. We have to just start from scratch. How do we get them on board, these big fast fashion retailers, and to collaborate with this new profile of designer or leader that it's in favor of more sustainable and responsible practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we're at a really interesting time now, because, you know, you'll be aware that a lot of people, especially younger people, have been rethinking the purpose of their, you know, careers and their paid employment for a while now. So we've seen a lot of people, you know, wanting to work in smaller businesses, wanting to have you know, more family friendly working conditions and that kind of thing. So I suppose that there's a pressure from people going into businesses, and that's one of the things, you know, that I recognized a few years ago. You know, obviously in fashion and marketing, you're always looking ahead, you know, horizon scanning, and sustainability has been coming as a big industry issue for a while. And so it's been inevitable that there will be roles within sustainable fashion, but also that the industry as itself would change. So now I'm sure you'll see there are lots more actual jobs in sustainability, you know, in compliance and those types of things. And so that's one of the reasons, you know, why I've thought about what we do in the classroom, how that prepares people for those jobs. And now those graduates are coming into those roles. And so they're pushing from below, but also there are some companies and organizations that are doing the change from the top, and that's going to be the most powerful, where you've got the kind of CEO buy-in as well as people pushing from the bottom. I mean, one of the things that as individuals, if we're lucky enough to have choices about where we put our energy, is to think about, you know, where we want to work and who we want to support. And it is one of the questions that my students brought up a few years ago on a panel of, you know, different people with different experiences in sustainable fashion, just saying, well, you know, should I go and work for a, let's say, a terrible company and try to make them better? Should I set up my own brand? Should I do this? And actually the answers were, you know, all of the above. Yeah, actually, maybe it takes some people to go and work in some of the bigger corporations to push them to change. But if that's not for you, then, you know, don't feel that you have to do that role. But I think as well as, you know, individuals and businesses, this is really something we need to recognize the structures around finance, you know, and taxation, and how some of the bigger, badder companies are supported by the existing sort of legislation in this area. So it's so that they can afford to be unsustainable. And I think it's something I find heartbreaking, that as much as we've seen the rise of social, you know, sustainability, of social enterprise, of smaller makers, of craft being recognized, we've also seen massive boost in, you know, in fast fashion and unsustainable practices. So it is still ongoing. But I think some of that, you mentioned greenwashing, some of that will be addressed now. I think, you know, the Competition and Markets Authority is being much firmer around advertising and claims. So I think businesses have to watch out for that. I think finance is getting a lot more pressure for green investment. So I think a lot more people who are investors are actually questioning where their investments are going. So there's a lot more public consciousness around bad practices, and hopefully that, plus some sort of legislation, can help put pressure on some of those bigger, you know, on the, not necessarily bigger, but some of the worst companies who have been getting away with, you know, exploitation of people and obviously of the environment if they're really overproducing and contributing to textile waste. And I think that's, you know, that's the dangerous bit for me. But also I think fashion media has a role to play in this. I mean, for me, stop celebrating bad practices. I mean, as an educator, I made a decision a few years ago. I didn't want to make sustainable fashion about pointing out who's doing the bad things. I kind of wanted it to be more about celebrating who's making good work. So, you know, I choose to elevate, support, shine the light on good practices and interesting new business models, because I think that's actually a more powerful way to engage people. But also, you know, if the media could try to do that as well, that would be fabulous, because, you know, we have to think, whose voices are we hearing? You know, what stories are we, you know, getting to know about? And I think that would be really helpful as well for the sector.
It is funny because when there's this bad, like big issues that impact everyone, it seems that the wider community tries to avoid them, and the media have a big role in just promoting that behavior, like, oh, that's too bad to think about it, let's continue with our life. And I don't know, I know it has to be an involvement of everyone. Every single person needs to be involved in this change. And that's what leads to my next question about these small initiatives. There's plenty, especially in the UK, there's plenty coming up everywhere to engage the smaller communities, local communities, into this change by educating consumers into better practices, which actually is just going back to basics. I remember my great-grandmother, my grandmother, fixing and mending the things at home, not only clothes, but a chair is broken, I just fix it. You can't afford to buy all the time new things. What do you think is the role of these local initiatives? Do you think they will be like key actors in this chain?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one of the things that I think happened, you know, for lots of people in the UK while they were under lockdown is, first of all, they were aware of all the stuff that they had, but they also, lots of people got involved in things like cooking or making, and they realized the pleasure that you get from that creativity, from that hands-on activity. And as much as, you know, the mending seen, I think, is a little bit of a trend with a small t, but it's a great trend. So I think a lot of people have seen that, the kind of visible mending, the darning and that kind of thing, as something really great to get engaged in a sort of creative sense. And obviously that has linked to sustainable practices. I mean, I'm really passionate about history of fashion, and I'm a bit obsessed with 1940s make, do and mend myself. So it's an area that I've always been really interested in, that kind of innovation of taking something, you know, a piece of clothing that's no good, you know, in its existing purpose, and then repurposing it. And I think it's been great to see how all of that kind of upcycling, mending, reconfiguring has become a sort of fashion trend that has then, you know, spread out amongst lots of an elevated making and mending. And I think, you know, there's a couple of things that I'd like to highlight here. I mean, I work for Glasgow Caledonian University. I work at the London campus, but our main campus is in Scotland. And there's a community-led organisation there, Sustainable Fashion Scotland. And they're just a group, exactly as you're saying, of people coming together, of makers, of students, of academics, of, you know, retailers, designers, coming together just to have a local conversation, to connect, you know, what's important in our local, you know, areas. How can we recognize the skills and you know, things that are going on here and elevate those, but also engage in big sort of international conversations. I think we saw a lot of that at COP26, didn't we? And then another initiative, a really good friend of mine, Susie Warren, had sort of almost accidentally started a global movement of mending activism called sort of street stitching, which was basically, she went to Oxford Street, took a deck chair and some mending and sat outside some of the fast fashion vendors, you know, mending. And then that developed into sort of collective mending activities. And she had a day where people were stitch it, don't ditch it. And it was just that kind of gentle activism and mending in public and starting conversations about mending. And it's something actually that I think is a really interesting, you know, and that just took off, I suppose, because of social media, virally. And, you know, stitch it, don't ditch it days happened all around the world. And lots of people who were, you know, maybe doing that in isolation just found that really nice to come together. But also, you know, members of the public being aware of that. And just as you say, having memories and thinking about either things that family members had made for them or mended for them, and just actually recognizing the value in that. And I think that's a really nice, that kind of mending movement has a really nice time. But I think, you know, lots of these organizations are, I'd say, political with a small p. And I think it's great because I think that local action can be really powerful, and lots of groups of local activists can have a really large voice.
Well, those were all my questions. Thank you so much. I really believe in the power of communities, and especially because we've seen what the globalization brought to us and the mess we are in now. So thank you so much for bringing your point and your opinion and your expertise to Liverpool Fashion Summit 2022. It was great chatting.
Thank you. It was really fabulous talking to you. I wish you every success. Thank you.